said he's doing Indian tribes next year.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So today, it's personal. Every one of you have lived in the 60s, including myself, although I was very young. Very young. But before we get into this, I have to tell you what I left out from last week. Mary Wollstonecraft, she had started to write a novel entitled Maria, or The Wrongs of Women. And it was a novel that was about this servant girl, Maria, and the trials and tribulations that she went through, basically being abused by men. It was commonplace in those days, this is the late 1700s, if you were a maid in some rich person's house, you were going to be approached by the man of the house, or maybe the sons, or who knows who, and you would either be possibly raped or hounded until you had sex with the man of the house. Very, very common. And this was something that she was bringing out in this book. And the problems that women would have also. Women, as you know, could be beaten by their husbands. And even if the husband did something that went beyond the law and broke the law in injuring her in some way, women, or wives, by law, could not, in court, testify against their husbands. So what are you going to do? So that was a big issue for her too. For Margaret Fuller, there's an interesting back and forth with her and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson, although advanced as he was as a transcendentalist, he was still a rather sexist sort of man. And on one occasion, some friends of theirs had a child who was a girl. And Emerson had the attitude of, well, even though it's a girl, it's still a sacred event. And Margaret Fuller called him to task for that. And the quote is, "I do believe, O Waldo, most unteachable of men, that you are at heart a sinner at this point. I entreat that you seek light in prayer upon it." And then for Elizabeth Cady Stanton, there's a really interesting anecdote for her. As I had said, she was a traveling speaker for a number of years and would travel through many of the less well-developed states, Ohio being among them, and to speak at various places. And she was very determined to get to where she was going, even in blizzard winter conditions. And there's this one story of her traveling to a particular place in Ohio, and there was a severe storm. It was wintertime, and she was advised, well, you're going to have to cancel your speaking engagement because you're just not going to make it. And she said, well, look, I have, if you guys have a sled or a sleigh and horses, I will rent them, and I'll still make it there. And even though everyone was saying you really can't, she did anyway, and she was wrapped up in a buffalo blanket and traveled 6 hours through this blizzard to get to her speaking engagement. So,
did anybody show up?
Well, there was somebody there, but they didn't have to travel 6 hours. They were local. But she made it, and she made her speaking engagement. Later on, she came across a man who was supposed to make a speaking engagement at the same place, although on a different topic. He was a historian who was going to talk about Sherman's March to the Sea. and she came across him, and he said, you know, that blizzard was just way too much. I wasn't going to go through that blizzard myself. And she said, well, so it took Sherman to march to the sea, but it took a woman to get through this blizzard. So that was a good one. So here we have Abbie Hoffman. Don't you just love this picture? I think that shows, here's a guy who's laughing and smiling and throwing a Molotov cocktail at you. That's kind of the guy he was. So I feel kind of bad. I didn't have a lot as far as a bibliography on either Abbie Hoffman or Timothy Leary, but I supplemented with a number of articles online. But anyway, so he wrote his autobiography in 1980 while he was on the run, and we'll get to that. But the autobiography, a very entertaining read, by the way. He's a very enjoyable and humorous person to read. I came across this in a used bookstore, and I thought, well, it's an interesting character. I don't know much about this guy. So I started flipping through the pages, and I thought, I gotta read this. He starts off just very humorous, talking about his upbringing and his poor dad, who had to put up with his rebellious youth. So yeah, it's a very entertaining read. So he was born November 20th, 1936. His parents, a Jewish household in a very Irish Catholic neighborhood. And it's really interesting to me, living back in the 40s and 50s, which I did not. In some neighborhoods, the culture was such that, especially you were pressured, both overtly and covertly, to conform to the culture of that particular neighborhood. He said when he was a kid, on the bus riding to school, and here's this Jewish kid in an Irish Catholic neighborhood going to school, he said he knew that as he passed the Catholic churches anytime, he better cross himself. Otherwise he was going to get beat up by the Irish Catholic kids on the bus. But anyway, his father was middle class. Oh, yes?
Is Abbie his actual name, or is it a shortened form of something?
Abbott. Abbott, yeah, like Abbott and Costello, yeah. And he said, there's a little anecdote, he said there's only two people who ever called him Abbott, and that was his father and the judge that was sentencing him. So his father, middle to upper middle class job that he had, he ran a successful medical supply company. Abbie himself was a very sharp kid, very intelligent, very energetic, and very rebellious. But he loved sports. He was into just about any sport that was offered to him, and he would sometimes just become obsessed with it. He loved bowling, of all things, and as a kid he would go to the bowling alley quite a bit. But in high school and in his youth, he played just about everything. He was a really hyperactive kid. He was also, as I say, a very rebellious kid, getting in trouble at school, and getting kicked out of one high school because he wrote a paper declaring himself an atheist, and very brash paper this was. And the teacher that confronted him tore the paper up right in front of him and kind of cussed him out. And he attacked the teacher. So he was kicked out of that school, and then he attended a private school. And here is Abbie Hoffman right here, the eldest of the three kids. He has a younger brother and a younger sister. So he finally makes it through school, and he goes to Brandeis University. Did I pronounce it? Brandeis. Thank you. Brandeis University. Some very prominent people teaching there at the time. Eleanor Roosevelt was teaching international relations. Leonard Bernstein, naturally, is teaching music. Abraham Maslow, who knows this name? Maslow, oh, very good. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, yes. And how about this one? Herbert Marcuse. Does that sound familiar to anybody? He was the nation's most prominent Marxist, according to Abbie, and he taught sociology. And these two men here, Abraham Maslow and Herbert Marcuse, were his mentors. He loved spending time with both of them, learning about Marxism, learning about psychology. And eventually he got his bachelor's degree in psychology. So he goes to UC Berkeley after this for his graduate degree in psychology, 1960. He's also dating a girl, and immediately after graduation, the two of them get married because she is pregnant. And so his girlfriend, Sheila, they got pregnant. It was an accident, he says. And very quickly after that, she is pregnant again, another accident. So they have two kids, Andrew and Amy. She was pregnant again after that, only this time they went and got an abortion. So at first he worked at Worcester State Hospital for 3 years. Worcester. Okay. Thank you. I should really check on these before I show up.
That's okay.
Worcester.
We love it when you're wrong.
Yeah. So he worked there for 3 years, mostly administering tests, psychological tests to people. The marriage did not work out well. It was an on-again, off-again relationship. They both were butting heads the whole time, and eventually divorced in 1966. It was in 1960, though, that he first got his real taste of protesting, and he felt like this was what he was called to do. He felt best when he was protesting something. And he knew, or he felt at the time, that he had to work to support his family. He had to make money. That's what everybody does. And so he worked at Westwood Pharmaceuticals as a sales rep who would travel through western and central Massachusetts. And he did very well at it. He realized that he could cheat on his expense account, and that once he set up the accounts in the various places, he knew he did not have to do much work after that, because they would just keep reordering the supplies. And so after a year or so, he could work about 10 hours a week and keep up and still make his pay raises and get paid well. And best of all, in his expense account, he had a car, a company car. So he drove around to all of these protests, and that's what he really did. He knew that this pharmaceutical company was supporting him in his protests throughout Massachusetts. So he was usually going to some sort of labor strike or rent strike, and marching in some sort of protest. He got hooked up with the NAACP in 1963, and he really felt a kinship with them. Here were people who were genuinely put upon, genuinely were not treated fairly in society. There were laws against, segregating people, and especially in the South. And so he was going to hook himself up with the local chapter in Massachusetts, and they were going to protest. Although he found at first that not much was happening. It was like a church meeting where people would get together and complain a little bit, and then somebody would write a letter to the president. And he said, they were doing nothing. So he got together with a couple of others, this Irish priest, Father Gilgan, and another African-American, Darmy Bailey, took over the chapter and started organizing people and started organizing protests. And so to the extent that the national office of the NAACP told them to start toning it down. They were causing too many problems and making the news.
Being effective.
Yeah, being effective in a sense. So he, for a few years, was with the NAACP and marching and protesting, involved in lawsuits with companies for not hiring African Americans, protesting in front of factories who would not hire black people. He said there's this one incident where he was with a gathering of people, they're protesting, and he was laying underneath their trucks of this pharmaceutical company. And his father shows up and says, I need to talk with my son. There's police barricades everywhere, and Abbie's laying underneath the wheels of this huge truck, and his father shows up and says, I need to talk to my son. And so they called him over, and so Abbie gets out from under the truck and goes over, talks to his father, and his father says, you're protesting my best customers. Please don't do this. And Abbie kind of felt for him, but he said, no, I'm still protesting. So, but of course there's plenty of protesting to be done because of segregation back in those days. Until 1966, with the Black Power movement, they were going to get rid of any white person in the organization. The NAACP was not going to allow white people to protest with them. And so Abbie was asked, he says in his autobiography, he was asked politely to leave. And so he did. A little more difficult for him, though, was when he, along with a few others, organized what they called the Liberty House. And this was a house, it was basically a store for poor people. And this was New York's Lower East Side. It was run by volunteers, and it was something for the poor people of the neighborhood. But again, with the Black Power movement, they wanted it completely run by black people. And so he was asked to leave again. And this time he was rather angry about this. This was something that he had organized. He put this together. He made it run. And so they said, you need to leave. And with his knowledge of the Black Panthers who were gaining power at the time, he wrote an article for the Village Voice. And so this is an excerpt from this. Well, first of all, his take on this with the Liberty House was that the Liberty House is not about race. This is about helping the poor. This is a class struggle. This isn't a racial issue. So he wrote in this, now I feel for the other whites, especially for the white females. I identify with all those Bronx chippies that are getting conned out of their bodies and bread by some dark-skinned Sharpie over at the annex. So yeah, very sharp, because he knew that there was a prostitution ring being run out of what they called the annex, and he was not going to let this lie. And just as a side note, many of you may know that the women's movement came belatedly to the 60s movement, all the protests of the 60s against the Vietnam War and segregation and all of that. The women's movement was not at the same time. It was a bit later. And he brought this out in his autobiography that there were an awful lot of very sexist hippies in those days that did not treat women well while they were protesting against segregation. So Abbie Hoffman, although you might consider him one of the quintessential hippies, had his own opinions about what he saw as the hippie movement. He saw a lot of people who were just stoned out, glassy-eyed zombies floating through the neighborhood head shop. How many of you know what a head shop is? All right, very good. That's where you get your drug paraphernalia from. But so you should be ashamed of yourself that you know that.
I learned it from my children.
Okay, all right. And of course, he knew Timothy Leary pushing LSD, and I'll get into him in a little bit. But Timothy Leary, although he took LSD himself, Abbie Hoffman would take LSD himself and thought it was a really impressive drug and enjoyable and all that. But he didn't care for Timothy Leary's movement, thought he was just creating a group of blissed out pansies ripe for annihilation. You get a bunch of people who are on LSD and sitting around staring at their navels, and he thought that was, that may be fun just to do on the side, but it's not going to solve any world problems. What he did learn, though, from Timothy Leary was that he needed to reach people's hearts and not just their minds, and so he took that to heart. And here you have some blissed out pansies right here. So the Lower East Side was where kind of the central place of the hippie movement, or the counterculture. I really should say counterculture, and that's what Abbie Hoffman considered himself, more as a counterculture leader rather than just a hippie. But he lived in a small apartment with his girlfriend Anita, and this was kind of the central area where a lot of things were happening. Allen Ginsberg, we all know who Allen Ginsberg is, right? The poet of the 60s that everybody wanted to know because his poetry spoke to this generation. There was a local head shop. There was a button shop, which is also very important because in the protesting movement, everybody had a button to wear that told everybody what you were protesting about. Andy Warhol lived nearby, and Bill Graham's Fillmore East, the place where many very big rock groups got started. You have the Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, the Doors, Jimi Hendrix, among others, who got their start there. And there's Bill Graham, Fillmore East. Kind of looks like he's flipping somebody off, but I'm not sure that he's actually doing that. Yeah, so you have Jimi Hendrix, Sly and the Family Stone, Joshua Light, I don't know. There's the Byrds. He also became a very effective community organizer. One thing that Abbie was very good at was organizing people. He was not just somebody who would go out and yell and march in the streets. He knew how to set up a phone bank to have people call many other people to organize these things. So he got together the local people of the neighborhood in the East Side and had a community organization to watch out for each other. They discussed the crime, the drugs, ethnic tensions, and police brutality. He knew that people who were arrested often were roughed up quite a bit by the police. And he made a connection with the chief of police and became good friends with him. And oddly enough, even though here's this chief of police who was arresting Abbie for various things throughout this time, the two of them became somewhat good friends. Their neighborhood watch, they had particular volunteers who would watch out for the people of the neighborhood and would watch as anybody would get arrested, making sure that if the police were roughing them up, the police were going to hear about it. So Abbie one day is very angry about somebody getting roughed up and goes into the police station and puts his foot right through this glass plate of some awards display. And of course he was arrested for that. And later on he talked with the chief of police. He said, you know, I'm really sorry about that, nothing personal, and sent him $50 to replace the glass. And he was actually on the city payroll for a short period of time because he was such an effective organizer. Of course, once people found out that Abbie Hoffman, of all people, was on the city payroll, they dropped him very quickly. And he became famous for his stunts. One stunt that he was very proud of, he was with a group of tourists going through the stock exchange, and he had a whole bunch of dollar bills, and once he was inside he started throwing them everywhere and causing a ruckus over that. He mailed 3,000 joints to random people in the phone book, and with each joint was a note saying that you could receive 10 years in prison for this, for possession of this joint, and it doesn't matter where you got it. Another stunt was throwing plastic bags of cow's blood, and I never really got the point of that. He didn't explain much of it. Dumping garbage in Lincoln Center. This was a new development, just for the heck of it. And one of his most famous was surrounding the Pentagon. And of course, this is a Vietnam War protest. They surrounded the Pentagon, thousands and thousands of protesters, and they were going to sit and meditate, and they were going to levitate the Pentagon about 10 feet or so. So here's the Pentagon surrounded by thousands of protesters. Of course, it was also surrounded by a whole bunch of soldiers, and this is where this iconic photograph of this guy putting flowers in the rifle ends of these soldiers. And of course, afterwards, he wrote up an article declaring success, that they had levitated the Pentagon and that the Vietnam War should be over soon. And so at this time, he wrote his book, Revolution for the Hell of It, which was really a manual for revolutionaries, how to organize protests and how to fight against the culture of the day. And you can't really make out what's on his forehead, so I will spell it out for you. It's F-U-C-K. Something that he enjoyed doing just to piss people off. And then, of course, the 68 Democratic Convention, the big riot that is still talked about today, that many people believe ruined the chances of having a Democratic president in 1968. So ahead of the week-long convention, they were sending out propaganda. They were telling people what they were going to do, and they were making up stories of what they were going to do and have done. one of the things was they were telling people that they have already planted marijuana plants in the local parks, and they were coming to reap the harvest during the Democratic convention. They said that they had prostitutes for all of the delegates there, and they were invited to use them. And the women who were going to show up for the Democratic convention, they were going to have gigolos, men seducing the women at the Democratic convention as well.
Yes.
Sadly, that was not true. So,
Good idea, though.
So, of course, the infamous Mayor Daley was not going to put up with this. He made sure that they did not get permits to protest in the parks. There was a permit for a concert. There was a band that was playing in the park ahead of or during that week, and that got kind of ugly because the police were on full alert and were sometimes beating people indiscriminately. Abbie, at this time in Chicago, was being tailed. He had a couple of guys who were following him wherever he went, and Abbie got the idea of, well, if they're going to follow me, they're going to follow me. So he walked right up to them and introduced himself and made friends with them. And they were a couple of nice guys, and so they had a nice chat, and every once in a while, during this week-long event, they would go out to lunch together, and these guys would buy lunch for Abbie. Abbie, along with a few others, were arrested the final day of the convention in order to keep him from inciting the riots, and he did not get to go in the final. Yes.
I have a recollection from way back when that they also tried to dump LSD in the city's water supply.
That was another bit of propaganda that was not true. That was something. Yeah, that's another one. I remember that now that you mention it. That they were going to, and so all of the delegates were going to be high on LSD during the convention. But again, that was just propaganda, just to get them thinking.
Did he
Yes.
ever address the idea of going to the Republican convention and stirring up trouble there, or just because the Democrats are weak and disorganized?
Well, you know that it was Lyndon Johnson who was president at the time. That's why they were focused on the Democrats, the war issue. The Republican, they talked about it, but it never amounted to anything. The Republicans were going to have their convention in, I think it was Southern California, and then they moved it to Florida because they felt that Florida was a more manageable place, the place in Florida they had. But there was no huge demonstrations as they had at the Democratic convention. So I came across this clip, and I want you to see, I'm not going to show the whole thing, but there's an interesting...
Well, let's go out and get some. So we go out and get some plastic water guns and some holy shit. You know,
there is some bad language, so
we say, you want to
be
try
careful.
it, you can get brain damage. You know, you run that risk, and they put it back because they're afraid to die. And the press is voyeuristic, and they're going to eat that goddamn thing up. And you look in Time magazine, man, and there it is, a fact. No quotes, no hoax, no nothing. Lace, the new wonder drug, makes you fuck. Going to the Pentagon.
But can that kind of thing protect people in Chicago? Or are you worried about that?
Yeah, I'm not worried about Chicago at all. Of course not. Never worry. Only mothers worry.
Chicago seems like we are hurting ourselves into a stockade. I mean, we're getting ourselves all together.
Well, see, what the Democratic Party, look at their theater, right? International Amphitheater. Have you ever been down there? Have you been to Chicago? Well, it's out of sight. It's right in the stockyard, see?
Yeah.
It smells like shit and death and piss. And it's boring. You know, they'll have like Kate Smith singing the national anthem, right? They'll have all these boring pigs, fat businessmen, very serious things, see? And they'll be showing this, see? And meanwhile, you know, like every 2 minutes out of every hour, there'll be us out in the streets or up in the park doing all this thing. Wow, 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 the new America, exciting. And it'll be like a football game, see? Football game's a good model.
Right.
Cops versus the Yippies or the National Guard or whoever, the paratroopers from Vietnam. I don't know who they're gonna bring back to contain us. They're gonna bring a lot of heavy equipment, see? And people will be watching that on TV and they'll say, we don't wanna watch that boring speech stuff. We wanna watch the Rose Bowl out there, you know? And they'll get mad. They'll say, why aren't they showing us that Rose Bowl? What are they showing us that boring stuff for? You know, man, a lot of people are gonna kick in their television sets that week. This week, you got America. They're all into Freud. Say to them, hey man, we're all getting laid, man. We're listening to music, we're having a groovy time. What do you want to work for? Talk to them about full unemployment. They know you don't work. And they're very intrigued by that. You don't work. No, I don't work, man. I'm just fucking around having a good time. That's disgraceful. They hate that in America. Don't work. Of course you don't work. You're never gonna work. What do you guys want to work for? For some haggy old wife and some kids that don't respect you?
I want to go to the con tomorrow. Do you want to come?
Tomorrow?
Yeah, I want to go tomorrow.
After Chicago, we go.
After Chicago, but I want to go.
You want to go now?
Well, now or tomorrow or soon.
Well, I guess you should go.
He's such a fascist.
No.
I'd like to go after we get back.
What does he have to say, this
Yeah,
guy?
fascist.
You're a
Says
fascist.
you're trying to drag me off the...
Come to the commune.
Come to the
Come to the commune.
Each take a nap. Just each take a nap.
Come to that with me.
You got the commune.
So there's Abbie Hoffman, very interesting character. I mean, that's the kind of guy he was, goofing around with his friends. I thought that was a very interesting clip, not staged, but just him chatting with his friends and talking about the kind of things that they're going to do in Chicago. And of course, as we know, it became pretty ugly. The police were beating quite a few people. Fortunately, no one was killed in this riot, but it was a pretty ugly scene. And of course, afterwards, you have, initially it was the Chicago 8. 8 of the ringleaders were indicted on charges of inciting riots. And so, and conspiracy and a host of other lesser charges. And Abbie Hoffman and his crew planned to make this a show. This was going to be something they were looking forward to. They were going to make the headlines. They were going to make a mockery of this court because they believed it was a mockery of justice. So in the lead up to the trial, they were going to make it like a baseball game. They were handing out tickets for people to show up to watch this. They dressed as baseball players. They had programs that they would call pogroms. And they had, in this program, it was the World Series of Injustice. And they had pennants and t-shirts and the whole bit. So here's the Chicago 8 until Bobby Seale was removed because he wanted a particular lawyer, but the lawyer was in the hospital going through having some operation and would be delayed. The judge said, well, if he can't make it now, he's not going to, so you're not going to get this lawyer. So he made a big deal of it, and he was ranting and raving in the court during court sessions. So the judge had him gagged and bound. and still he was creating noise, jumping around in his chair and rattling his chains, whatever he could hit, metal against metal. So finally the judge had enough and gave him 4 years for contempt of court and sent him out. Unfortunately, there were no photography wasn't allowed in the court, but they did have the artists' renderings. So here's Bobby Seals all chained up. So now it's the Chicago 7, and their attorney was William Battling Billy Kunstler as the defense, and he could be just as flamboyant as any of the Chicago 7 and would yell back at the judge. The judge, Julius Hoffman, of all things, his same last name, who was, this was kind of like a study in contrast, where the judge could be just as awful yelling at the people in the court as Abbie Hoffman would be yelling back at him. A rather poor choice of a judge that people will tell you now, because he was not, in any sense, even-handed. He was clearly for the prosecution, and everybody knew it. So, making a circus out of this whole mess, they would have this long list of defense witnesses, and many of whom had really nothing to do with the legal issues at hand. So they had Judy Collins, and they told her, "We want you to sing up on the stand." And so when they called her up, she starts singing, "Where have all the flowers gone?" And the judge tries to interrupt her and saying this has nothing to do with the case, and she refused to stop singing. And so he called the bailiff and said, "Put your hand over her mouth to stop her." But this went on for days and months. They had poets, playwrights, comedians, and they did have a few eyewitnesses. But they made a circus of it on purpose. And then when Abbie got to the stand, he took several days himself, just messing with the court. Let's see. I have a really good bit here. So when he first gets up, and they asked him what your name and where do you reside, so he says, "I live in Woodstock Nation." And so they asked, "Well, where is that?" "It is a nation of alienated young people. We carry it around with us as a state of mind, the same way the Sioux Indians carried the Sioux Nation around with them." And then the judge interrupts, "Okay, just tell us where it is." And he says, "It is in my mind. It is in the minds of our brothers and sisters. We carry it around with us just as the Sioux Indians did." And this goes on and on and on. It just gives him the runaround. Virtually every question he would make into an issue like that. But he enjoyed himself through the whole thing. And he would give that judge hell just for the heck of it. And of course, the judge is Jewish, and he would yell at him, "You're a disgrace to the Jews, and you would have served Hitler better." He got some time, of course, for contempt, although in his autobiography, Abbie, he says he kind of liked the judge, and he got the feeling that the judge thought of him as like a wayward child and felt for him. And he said some years afterwards, there was a guy who he was talking with who knew the judge and said, "Judge Julius thinks fondly of you." And he said, "I kind of liked him too." So the verdict, they were not guilty of conspiracy because they convinced the jury that they couldn't agree even on lunch, let alone anything else. But they were found guilty of inciting a riot, but it was overturned on appeal. And the judges who were in the appeals process were appalled at the judge. Judge Hoffman was clearly biased against them, and that came out, and so everything was overturned. And the investigation on that riot at the Democratic Convention, they found that it was a police-incited riot, and they called it that, a police riot. So, now, one of the things that Abbie was very good at was self-promotion and the promotion of his ideas. He said that several times ad agencies would contact him wanting him to work for them because he could sell anything. And so, how's this for a book title? He came out with this book in 1971, Steal This Book. And what this book is about is how to live for free by stealing everything. He had traveled the country talking with homeless people, talking with con men, talking with the police, and getting all the best ideas of how to get things for free. The best way to shoplift, the best way to get a meal at a restaurant. The idea, of course, at a restaurant is you come up with a letter saying that you are a food critic for such and such magazine. You hand it to the manager, and the manager sets you at a nice table, and whatever you want, you got it for free. And of course, how to hook up your telephone lines to the wires so that you can get free phone service was another one. But yeah, this book was just chock full of ways to live for free. So, Abbie claims that the police set him up, or the FBI, I should say, set him up in 1973 on a cocaine charge, that they planted the cocaine in the building where he was, and so he was arrested. So he knew he was going to be convicted, and so out on bail, he went on the run. And he spent the next 6 years, 74 to 80, on the run in the United States and down in Mexico. But he was still an activist, and he still was protesting. And there's this one in particular on the St. Lawrence River. There is the Army Corps of Engineers was going to have this new project to dredge the river, so for barge traffic. And he organized the people in that area to protest against this, and they got a stop to it. But his name was Barry Free at that time, and he was congratulated in Congress for his work. He came out of hiding in 1980, was on trial. He got a total of 1 year for those charges, and he got out in 4 months. Served 4 months of that 1 year sentence. So in the 1980s, he's a changed man now. He's not the wild radical that he once was. He doesn't do the crazy stunts like he used to, but he's still protesting against the CIA in Nicaragua, and very often it was environmental issues that he was protesting against, and a very effective, energetic protester. He was, here's another interesting trial that he was in. He was trespassing at University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and in the trial, his defense was the university says that they only, what he was protesting was the recruitment of CIA agents at the university. And he says the policy of the university is to only work with law-abiding agencies. And he set out to prove that the CIA was not a law-abiding agency. and he proved it, and so he got off. So, another interesting thing through the 80s, he had a very good friend who worked with him as a radical of the 60s, Jerry Rubin, who was almost as prominent and almost as crazy as he was. Jerry Rubin, in the 1980s, is no longer a hippie, or a yippie as they call themselves, the Youth International Party, so he called himself a yippie, not a hippie. But Jerry Rubin, in the 1980s, was no longer a yippie, he became a yuppie. And the two of them, and I saw this on YouTube, the two of them had this debate. Jerry Rubin in suit and tie, well manicured hair on one side of the stage, and Abbie Hoffman on the other. And they were debating each other as to Jerry Rubin saying, I don't regret anything I did back in the 60s. What we did was right, but I have moved on. I am now a successful businessman, and I am an adult, and I make a living for my family. And Abbie Hoffman is stuck in the past. So Abbie Hoffman says, I am still a revolutionary, I still protest, but I'm not a Mother Teresa. I make money for my speaking fees and all that, but I still am protesting for all the injustices of the world or of this country. But it was very interesting to see the two of them on stage. So, sadly, he committed suicide 1988 or 89, I forget. But he was found dead in his apartment. He had ingested 150 phenobarbital pills along with some liquor. And there are some, of course, who will say that it was the CIA that did that to him, that he wouldn't have committed suicide. But it was well known that he suffered from bipolar disorder. He was very manic and then depressed. That was not something that was a secret. So it was ruled a suicide. So his legacy, he was in the 60s one of the most visible and flamboyant of the protest counterculture movement. He helped transform the way both the courts and the police deal with people like him. And I think even if you do not agree with Abbie Hoffman in what he did or what he said or what he stood for, I think he did a great service for the United States in that our court system and our police system learned how to deal with very difficult people, learned how to preserve the rights of people who sometimes you don't want to preserve the rights for. So in that sense, he did a great service for our country, and of course challenged foreign policy, bringing up many things that atrocities that our troops have occasionally committed, and brought that to light. And so on this final one, I think he would enjoy this picture very much. That's the kind of guy he was. He had a good time just sticking it to the system. And you might see on his forehead the F-U-C-K there. Any questions? Yes?
I didn't notice, what was the year of his autobiography?
1980. It was like while he was on the run, he wrote this. It was 79, 80 that he was writing this, yeah.
When did he die?
I think it was 88 or 89. I should have had that in here, but it was right about there. Yeah.
Do you think he might have produced a president that thinks everything's a show?
Hard telling. The thing about Abbie Hoffman, he's the type of guy who will challenge your beliefs, whatever it is that you believe. And there's many things that I cannot in any way relate to with him, especially in that steal this book thing that he came up with, that it was, and I have one of the sayings that he had, that it's wrong to steal from an individual, but it's wrong not to steal from like the corporates, giants. And yes.
I owned that book for some time.
Did you?
And one of the neatest things in it was it had all the foreign currencies that could duplicate for American currencies in coin machines.
Oh, really? Okay.
Cool. If you used something that was worth nothing, as a quarter, you had a list of all the ones.
Yeah, yeah. So I have to ask you, are you living for free?
No, someone stole it.
Yeah. Well,
I loaned it to somebody and never saw it again.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, there's a whole story behind that book as far as getting it published. I mean, who in the world's going to publish it, for one thing? And what bookstore is going to have a book in it that says, steal this book? So, yeah, in one sense, he had a hard time getting it out there, but once it was, everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people really wanted that book. So, yeah.
Is it still in print?
Yes, you can go on Amazon and it is there.
We'll steal it from you.
Yeah.
I wonder what his kids think of him.
So there's one kid that I did not mention, was born with his second wife, I think, who is named America. America with a lowercase a. And he said, I want that on purpose, lowercase a. I don't know a lot about what happened to his children. So here's Timothy Leary. Don't you like this picture? It's very apropos of Timothy Leary. So again, I only have one book in the bibliography. I apologize for that. This is a very good biography of Timothy Leary. 689 pages, very detailed. So he was born October 22nd, 1920, the only child of an Irish Catholic family. His father was a dentist, but abandoned the family when Timothy was 14, although he still stayed in Timothy's life, and they were still in communication, but he had left the family. He went to West Point at his father's instigation in 1940. Of course, the war is coming to the United States very soon, but at West Point, he was a bit of a problem because he liked to drink. He was, I don't know that he would be considered an alcoholic, but he did drink quite a lot, and he got in trouble for it at West Point. He was pressured into dropping out and resigning his position there. He went to the University of Alabama, where he was kicked out because he was found in the women's dormitory. Two things that were great weaknesses for him was liquor and women.
Where was he born?
You know what? I didn't put that in there, did I? Yeah, not sure, sorry. He was, when he was kicked out of the University of Alabama, he lost his draft deferment, and so he was drafted in 1942. He was working with the artillery and lost some of his hearing, which he suffered greatly later in life, but he injured his ears at that time. He never went overseas. He stayed stateside and continued his education. He married Marianne Bush in April of 1945 and got his bachelor's degree in psychology at that same year. So they had two children, Susan and Jack. These two children grow up, and I'll get to this later, but they had a rather unfortunate childhood. He helped develop in the 40s and 50s the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. He got his PhD in 1950 in clinical psychology, and his wife committed suicide in 1955. Well, it was, there's another one I dropped. Yeah, I got to get onto this. During this time, in the 50s, again, he was a fairly heavy drinker, as was his wife. He also slept around, cheated on her quite a bit, and encouraged her to do the same. She had issues with depression before they were married. The alcohol and cheating just made it worse. And so she committed suicide on his birthday in 1955. She baked him a birthday cake early in the morning and then went out into the car in the garage and started the car up and killed herself with carbon monoxide. So he woke up to a birthday cake and his dead wife on his birthday. So he got hired on at Harvard in 1959. He was married 5 times. I just want to say that now. Divorced every one of them except the one that committed suicide. Other than that, his wives didn't have a lot to do with his career, so I just wanted to get that out of the way at this point. So at Harvard, 1959, he was feeling like he was at a dead end. He could see in his studies that psychotherapy that everybody was using to help people with mental illness was not working. It didn't help anybody. And so, again, he was drinking heavily and he had a nervous breakdown. And then he comes across someone who tells him about the magic mushrooms. He would go to Mexico during the summers, and he had read about from various people, including Aldous Huxley. Everybody knows who Aldous Huxley is, right? Brave New World. So amongst his friends, they wanted to try these magic mushrooms. And so his quote after this experience was that I learned more in 6 or 7 hours than all my years as a psychologist. And here they are, magic mushrooms found in Mexico. And so he came back to Harvard very excited, saying that this is an area that needs to be explored. And since they were not illegal, since the government didn't even know about them, he was given permission to do whatever clinical studies he wanted to. They had really no restrictions on it. And so at his house, he would invite people over to have this experience, and they were all supposed to write down what was happening to them, and he would be taking it as well. And at first, it sounded very clinical, but as time went on, it just became a group of people coming by his house to get high. And this was with his students, not the undergraduates. He would say he would never invite undergrads over to his house, but the graduate students he would encourage and sometimes even pressure them to take these mushrooms because they needed to know about this experience if they were going to be effective at all in their careers. And of course, eventually they are synthesized into, and this is another one, psilocybin, I think it's pronounced, pills, because that's the active ingredient. He gets to know Allen Ginsberg, who comes over and is very excited about this experience. And while he's high, he strips himself nude and calls himself the new Messiah. And he wants to call up, and this is like 62 or 63, he's going to call Kennedy and Brezhnev, or Khrushchev, I'm sorry. He's going to call Kennedy and Khrushchev and solve this world issues, and there will be no nuclear war because everybody's going to be high on magic mushrooms. And he got permission to work with people who were incarcerated. He believed that he could get people who were in jail and who were going to get out of jail. He was going to reduce the this word always gets me, recidivism rate. I have to say that slowly because I mess it up every time. But, and again, he was given permission. Harvard College and the prison said, you do what you think is right. And so he treated volunteers who were going to get out, and he was going to work with them and as they got out, and he was going to make sure that they were not going to commit crimes again by using the psilocybin. So he claimed after a time that this was successful, but he knew that it was not. He fudged the numbers, and so he made a big name for himself, not only amongst the students, but amongst academia and the prison system. He's claimed success, that he's reduced, that people who have taken this no longer want to commit crimes. So this is a wonderful find. And so now he finds out, he learns about LSD, which is a similar drug, only a lot more powerful. And his first experience with LSD, he's there with his girlfriend at the time, and he bursts into tears, and she's crying also, and he's just thinking this is, first of all, he's thinking, I know that I'm already dead, that life is an illusion. He goes on and on like that, and finds this is just the most wonderful experience in the world, and everybody needs to know about this. So he started the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, if 1963. And at this point, he doesn't care much for his duties at Harvard, and they fire him because he's just not around anymore. He's stopped working with his students, and so they let him go. He claims later that they let him go because he was into LSD too much, but it was basically he wasn't doing his job. But he needed to find a place, again, for his organization, so everybody could get together and learn more about this experience. So he went to Mexico because he was used to that, and he had a bunch of other people come. They paid their $10 to join his group, and they were all going to go down to Mexico and get high. And lots of people did it. And the Mexican authorities realized that this was a problem. They did not want this guy drugging everybody up and saying that this was something that Mexico endorsed. So he was kicked out of Mexico, traveled to Dominica and kicked out, went to Anguilla and kicked out. And finally, he had a connection with the kids of the Mellon family, who were multimillionaires, and they let him use a home that they had, one of their many homes, on a 2,500 acre ranch in New York, Millbrook, New York, and they got to use the Millbrook Mansion. And so something like 65 rooms in this house, and so this was going to be his headquarters now, and he was going to share his knowledge with the world. So he now has the Castalia Foundation. And again, he was going to spread the news about LSD, and so he got a lot of attention. People came from far and wide to get this experience, and of course, this and some of them were actually husbands and wives with their kids, which was very tragic. I'm leaving out some of the stories of Leary's poor kids, who had to endure some of the weirdos in their house doing really crazy things. One particular party, when his daughter had a sleepover of her girlfriends in the house, and Leary had some of his friends over getting high on LSD. And that was a very ugly situation, trying to get this one guy from going after the girls. Very irresponsible of him, to say the least. Anyway, so here's another situation where you have not just ordinary hippies coming for these LSD trips, but families with children living in this house. And it became a sort of house of horrors. And of course, LSD was not the only drug that was being used. And once the notoriety got out there, the police got involved and would raid the house now and again. And this was being led by none other than G. Gordon Liddy. And we all know who G. Gordon Liddy is, right, of Watergate fame. So he's traveling, he's on vacation at one point, and he's traveling down to Laredo to cross over into Mexico. The Mexican officials recognize him and say, "You are not coming back into Mexico." So at the border, he has to turn around, but he has to go through U.S. customs now, even though he didn't even make it into Mexico. He has to go back through the U.S. border, and he's stopped and arrested. They have 1 ounce of marijuana. They got rid of all the rest of it, secreted it away, but he was caught with 1/2 an ounce, and he was facing 20 years for that, which is pretty crazy. But it was a long, drawn-out case that actually went to the Supreme Court. One of the oddities of the marijuana laws at that time was that you could be arrested for having marijuana, but you would also be charged with not paying the marijuana tax because there was a tax on marijuana. And so that issue went all the way to the Supreme Court. He made himself an expert in the law at this point, and he said it's contradictory for one thing, but it goes against the law of self-incrimination. And he said, if you have marijuana and you're going to pay a tax, you have to incriminate yourself to do it. And it went to the Supreme Court and they agreed. So everything eventually was overturned. But that was years. It was not something that happened quickly. So we all know the slogan, right?
Turn on, tune in, and drop out. Drop out of high school, drop out of college, drop out of graduate school, drop out of junior executive, drop out of senior executive, turn on, tune in, drop out.
The importance of that to me is that it was a demonstration on the part of the baby boom generation of their numbers, of their strength, of their clout, of their power, which is the straight quantity numbers. There were 76 million Americans born between the years 46 and 64. They were trained by Dr. Spock to be demand fed. They were the first consumer species. They were the first electronic species. But the very fact that you were an American and young meant that you deserved the world.
So yeah, his famous slogan, turn on, tune in, and drop out. What he became famous for. And it was such a catchy slogan that at the time, there were actually companies that would take that and use it in their campaigns. And so there was an example of a restaurant that said, tune in, turn on, and drop out with our seafood buffet. That doesn't really go together, but it's a catchy slogan. So he becomes very famous as the guru of LSD. He turned to Eastern mysticism, Hinduism, and he felt that that was very appropriate for the experience that you would get with LSD. And he had a performance. He started out at the Village Theater with 2,000 people. It was always a packed house. He had slogans, titles like Death of the Mind, The Reincarnation of Christ, and then that would build into a traveling tour throughout the country, speaking at college campuses, and he was always a big hit. Dr. Timothy Leary, The Reincarnation of Jesus Christ, of all things. And an example, he would put on this outfit. He was wear white linen outfits, kind of an Eastern Hindu look to him, and people were just enthralled with this. And for me, it's kind of like what I said about transcendentalism. It's stuff that I just cannot relate to personally at all. Makes no sense, even less than transcendentalism, I think.
So you're leery of LSD?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, you know, it's funny. The drug itself, I mean, I don't know anything about or much about it, but he took it hundreds and hundreds of times. And it's not like heroin. It's not like cocaine. You can do this for, you know, at least he did for many years, hundreds if not thousands of times, and he still had his mind fairly intact. So, I mean, I don't know what it exactly does for you or to you, but it doesn't seem to have the same damaging effects as many of the drugs that we're using today, you know, meth or whatever, that just totally destroys people.
Research that, I forget what conditions it might help, it's not.
Yeah. Right, there's new research that I understand. Well, in Denver, it's not LSD, but it's the mushrooms are now legal. California is debating it now, making the psilocybin legal, which is a more mild form of, you know, the same effect. So,
I was in graduate school at the time. I never did it, but I talked to people who did, and they were the most interesting of people. And they listened very carefully to what you said, asked
And they
really
loved it.
intelligent questions.
I had lots of friends that did it. I never did it, but they all loved it.
Yeah, there seems to be
They're
kind of a
very
growing
religious
consensus.
kinds of.
Yeah, I've heard people say the same.
I didn't understand. Are you supposed to stay on this permanently?
What?
Or do it once a week or once a year?
Well,
or what?
he would claim that he would do it maybe once a week or so. And it lasts, you know, about, I don't know, 6 or 7 hours through the day. And it's supposed to be this enlightening experience that gives you another take on life. And so, yeah.
But then after the 6 or 7 hours, you're back on Earth.
But his argument would be that even though, you know, the high only lasts a few hours, the insights into reality and the universe stay with you. So, and I've heard kind of the same from others. I don't know if you have heard of Sam Harris, but he's a big YouTube guy, and he's into a lot of different things. But he says that in his youth he did LSD, and he says that it really does do something for expanding your mind. And this is a guy who's about as sober a person you'll ever come across. Yes.
People in the room may know, but there's a writer, Michael Holman, who does nonfiction writing, and he has a book out maybe a year ago called How to Change Your Mind, and he hits every one of the psychedelics, their history, what they are doing with them now in different parts of the world, and he himself used them all, and then writes very clearly about his experiences. And he attributes the illegal aspect of the psychedelics to the excesses of Timothy Leary.
Well, It was legal until, I think, 1966.
And his argument is along the lines of the powers that be in the government felt that this particular movement would cause resistance to U.S. military policies and U.S. war efforts and the Cold War. And so they just...
Well, I think in the 60s, at the culture as a whole, the people who were in power and the Richard Nixon silent majority types were frightened. The reason Nixon became president was because there's so many people who were just really frightened of this, the counterculture movement, wanting to destroy civilization, and that was, the drug culture was a part of that. So yeah, I can see.
He was so loud and had his hands in like Harvard and these places that they just kind of went after it.
Somebody, yes.
So nowadays they're using tiny doses of LSD or psilocybin to treat PTSD.
Right, right. Yeah, and yeah.
Was it a success with it?
I've heard the same, that with a psychologist there with them going through this experience, that apparently they can walk through their PTSD issues, and it's supposed to help them. Yeah, I've heard that too.
LSD is not addictive. It is
Yeah,
not an addictive
right,
drug.
right.
It's not like an opioid.
Yeah, like I said, it's very different from a lot of the really awful drugs that are rampant now, whether it's meth or heroin or any of the opioids that really just destroy you with their addictiveness. But LSD apparently is not addictive and doesn't have a lot of strange side effects afterwards. Anyway, so 1969. He's arrested. He's been arrested a number of times. This time, the judge is going to try to make it stick. He's given 10 years for these drug charges, and they're marijuana charges. And interestingly, the judge wanted to send him to a prison for the criminally insane. And in that process, he was taking some psychological tests that he had developed himself. So he knew exactly what answers to put on this test. So eventually he was sent to a minimum security facility, but he had connections with the weathermen, the weather underground, and they were going to get him out. So his job was to get out of the facility, and they picked him up and took him off. But so he knew he could climb up onto the roof. It was a foggy evening, and he climbed up onto the roof, grabbed the telephone wires, and pulled himself across over the fence and dropped down onto the ground at the telephone pole. And he was picked up by a couple of women with the weather underground. So here's his arrest and mugshot. But with the weathermen also were the Black Panthers. And so he's in Algeria with Eldridge Cleaver, who's set up kind of an embassy for the Black Panthers in Algeria. And they give him, they let him stay there for a while. Eldridge Cleaver, being a very power-hungry guy and very controlling and manipulative, it didn't work out very well. And he actually had some drugs on him when he arrived there in Algeria. And he said, Eldridge Cleaver told him that, you're lucky you weren't shot. The government here does not tolerate drugs as well as the United States does. We shoot people here for that. Eldridge Cleaver used drugs all the time, but he had an official capacity and he got away with it. But eventually, Eldridge Cleaver didn't care for him too much and considered him just kind of a weak druggie instead of a solid stone cold killer like the people that he likes. So he went from Algeria to Beirut, to Jordan, to Cairo, back to Algeria again, and then to Switzerland, and of all places he went to Afghanistan. And I'm not really sure why that was a place he felt the need to go, but that's where he was finally arrested by authorities and sent back to the United States. How that happened was, my guess, is that the right officials bribed the powers that be in Afghanistan to get him out, because there was no extradition treaty with Afghanistan at the time. But that's where the authorities finally got him. So he came back and he was given an extra 5 years of prison sentence, but then he was pardoned by Governor Jerry Brown in 1978. And so now he's out. And of course, he's a big celebrity speaker throughout the 80s. He had to tone down the LSD bit, but he was still a popular guy and became friends with many celebrities, including G. Gordon Liddy, who went to prison as well. And they would travel together with speaking engagements and talking about their prison experiences, and became good friends. And of course, he had other Hollywood friends that would hang out with him. Johnny Depp, I think, among them. Susan Sarandon, I think, was another. And he loved computers, so he came up with his own little slogan for computers: turn on, boot up, and jack in. So here's G. Gordon Liddy sitting there with Leary.
What a pair.
Yeah. You think, how in the world would those two guys get along? So he died of prostate cancer May 31st, 1995. And he was going to, he was looking forward to this. He was very cheerful. When he found out that he was dying, he was going to be merging with the entire life process. And he wanted his death to be recorded. And so when he felt that the time was coming, he was on camera and he repeated over and over again, why and why not? And those were his last words. He had wanted initially to be frozen, that cryogenic process, and then woken up years in the future, but he changed his mind near the end and said, I just want to be cremated. And so he was cremated, and his body was sent into space along with 23 other celebrity dead people. Yeah, that's, I remember that being a news, what's that?
What company set up?
It was an official government satellite.
NASA was the only one at that time that was.
Yeah, that was NASA. Yeah.
So is he still circulating?
No. So I don't know if you guys remember. I remember this as a news feature that Timothy Leary was being sent into outer space, but it was along with 23 others. They lasted up there for 6 years, and then the satellite plunged back into the Earth, burned up.
Where'd it go?
It burns up in the atmosphere, and I think that was what it was designed to do. Yeah. Yeah, stardust, that's good. So his legacy, he brought the LSD debate to the forefront of public discourse. People really had to look at this. He probably did a disservice to it ultimately because of, on the one hand, he was not honest.
That's where he is.
Somebody got to deal with that cat.
He likes cats.
Yeah. Okay. He was he was not honest about his experience and what LSD could and would do. When pressured, he was taken before the Senate to testify at one point, and he very gravely noted that there are dangers to LSD, and I recognize that, and that it should be legal, but you should have training, kind of like getting a pilot's license or something like that. If you were to buy LSD, you should have a license for it. And then at other times, he would proclaim that LSD is the panacea for the world, and that world problems would end if only we would all take it. Anyway, because of him, drug policies were reconstructed. He was a great inspiration for millions of disillusioned youth. I don't know that he led them in any right direction, but he was an inspiration and inspired new ways of looking at life values. And again, a lot of it was kind of an Eastern mysticism type of philosophy. Yes?
Did he get some of that from his partner, Richard Alpert?
Richard Alpert, I left out because I'm way over again, but a very close friend of his who worked with him at Harvard, Richard Alpert, who also who is actually fired from Harvard for different reasons, but the two of them worked together, and he actually went to India and became a kind of a Hindu mystic, and changed his name. I forget what. Babaram Das. Okay. But I'm sure that was an influence. But I think they were together on that. It wasn't like the one pulled the other into that philosophy. Yes.
There is a chapter of his life which you have not mentioned, and that is his research on dolphins and on marine mammals in general. And he spent a lot of time with dolphins, and then he started immersing himself in dolphin tanks as a means for sensory deprivation.
I thought that's part of the CIA.
When you experience long-term sensory deprivation, you start hallucinating. And so he was really quite. Some of the work that he did on dolphins was really quite pioneering and quite significant. It's still,
okay.
And you found only one biography of him. People should go and read his work on dolphins.
Yeah, there's a lot there. He wrote a number of books on his experiences, and I wasn't entirely familiar with that whole dolphin experiment that he did, but there's a lot more. Obviously, there's only so much I can do in this lecture, but there's a lot to him. Both he and Abbie Hoffman, there's quite a number of works that can be accessed, and both of their own works and biographies on them. Yes?
Albert came to Princeton and spoke. Terribly charismatic.
Oh, really? Yeah.
It's hard to listen to him and not go buy some LSD.
Well, another thing that was kind of disingenuous of Timothy Leary about what LSD would do for people. I mean, his friend was gay, and that was something that was not accepted, back in the 50s and 60s. And he had, Timothy Leary did this Playboy interview where he talks about what an aphrodisiac LSD is, and that it will cure homosexuality. That you have this state of mind that you perceive reality, and so it will bring you out of being a homosexual. And it completely made up, entirely. He was not a very honest person in a lot of ways. And his children grew up really awful too. His daughter blew the brains out of her husband and committed suicide herself. But okay, anything else? Yes?
What's up for next week?
That's it. Although in the fall, I'm going to be talking about various Indian tribes. So it'll be a 5-week course I'll be talking about the Comanche, the Sioux, the Narragansett, the Hopi, and the Cherokee. So, yeah. Something else?